Ta-da! Well, welcome everyone to our second public steering meeting. If you're joining late, this is our agenda doc. It's missing from the calendar invite. I think right now from steering, it's just Paul and I. Michael's running late. And I think the Google representatives.
There he is.
Yeah, and I think
There's
the Google representatives can't make it today.
Okay, so the first thing on the agenda today, and I realized in a moment of panic shortly before this meeting started that I had a couple other related agenda items that didn't get on there, but I think they're pretty quick. So we had, if folks saw the mail that I sent last week after our public meeting, we were going to break out for a separate discussion about the relationship between steering and TOC. And thank you, Matt Moore, for setting up public conversation around that one yesterday. And I think there's a recording, Matt, that you've posted, so folks can check the dev. And I think that's on the users list too, if you want to watch a recording of that. Here were my takeaways. Is the first one is that in our conversation yesterday, the folks present seemed to feel that it makes sense for steering and TOC to be separate. And the reason for that is that we feel, and just to put a fine point on it, since it's maybe a question that some other folks have had, is that we felt in our discussion yesterday that a distinction to make between the two that made sense to people is that in terms of project leadership, that the TOC is the seat of like the technical leadership, and that steering is above TOC in terms of if you had to order them, that steering has a higher degree of authority than TOC, but is mostly about people leadership, project leadership, administration. And I'll stop there because that's my own interpretation. So Matt, Brenda, other folks that were there yesterday, do you feel that's a fair characterization?
Yeah, that pretty much sums it up. I think we started the conversation off with like, what does steering currently do and should do? And it was pretty clear that the responsibilities were drastically different.
Yeah. So there's, I'm certainly open to another meeting for us to continue discussing that. I didn't hear from yesterday that we had another one scheduled yet. Matt, do you have any thoughts on that?
I'm happy to set it up again, even if we don't discuss that particular topic. You know, if it works as, you know, another forum for public discussion on another thread of things. I know, so I was looking at the sort of list of folks dialed in. I know Doug had missed the call yesterday, but I don't see him dialed in. And
I'm here.
Oh, all right. I missed scrolling through the attendees. So I know you had missed it, and I think this was a comment that you had on the original thing. So I didn't know if you wanted to comment on that.
No, I bow to the will of the group.
Paul, you're muted.
All right. The other thing that I wanted to make sure that I surfaced in our meeting today from yesterday was, I think, a recognition in that conversation that we don't feel like we know exactly the best final state to get to for how we would vote for end user seats and for who should be eligible to vote. And in terms of what we thought we should do about that is maybe just call out explicitly that we recognize it's something to improve, but we don't need to block on it right now. You know, one thing that I'd love some input on from folks that are here today, you know, or if you're watching this on YouTube, is I'd love to know examples of where end users are represented well in open source governance. I think that would be great if folks can point us to specific things that they have done or that they've seen work well. And I think those were kind of my two big ones from yesterday. And I defer, you know, if anybody has extra points they'd want to make on top of those two high level ones.
Well, I can speak to Kubernetes as a model that has some interesting overlap. And I think one of the nice things about Kubernetes is that you're starting to see more of an influx, sort of the handoff between cloud interests and more of the end user interests. And I think that's a natural evolution, right? Because these projects have to be funded from the start in one way or the other. And it's natural that the early tendency of features and the roadmap and all those things are going to be tended toward adoption and selling products that are built on top. But at some point, the roadmap and that impetus has to start switching more toward the end users, because that's going to, ideally, that's going to become the greater percentage of people developing in the long term. So Kubernetes certainly has opened the door for other end user companies to be part of the steering committee. And I think it's actually really beneficial. I think making an explicit like customer advisory seat in the steering committee is also something that's interesting. I don't know if I could point to one. I think Istio might be going toward this model. I've heard of other you know, maintainer seats, like Linkerd has in their maintainer group has somebody that's an end user as well in the maintainer group. So that ability to say, hey, we maybe have different interests that are more end user focused, I think is a really important thing, just as an inflection point in the life cycle of a project. Yeah,
and I'd certainly echo, you know, the statements that you made, Jaice, about end user representation in Cube. If I remember correctly, in terms of the mechanics, there is not a distinction made in Cube between the contributor seats and end user seats. They're all just open to either, right? Yeah, and there's the same criteria applied for eligibility, whether you're an end user or someone that is a developer or actively contributing as your primary role in the project code contributions, right? There's no distinction between those two paths into steering.
No, and I think that having the steering tied to the individual and not necessarily the company. I mean, there is company limits because you don't want somebody gaming the system and becoming majority, you know, for nefarious purposes. But yeah, I mean, as an end user, you have as much right to step up into leadership as anyone else, and it's a really powerful thing for sure. But you know, I think that there's certain mechanics there that depend on it being such a massive community and such large adoption, whereas in this community is still, you know, finding the community and getting the word out and growing. So I think that being explicit and maybe having some mechanism through which you can have an advisory position or something is definitely something that if I had still remained on the steering committee, I would have probably pushed for, because I think it's super valuable.
Yeah, and just for context, if maybe folks are watching this and they haven't read the proposal yet, at this point in time, as we're recording this, in the proposal, there are 5 of 7 total steering seats that are designated as contributor seats, and 2 are designated as end user seats. So we do have in our current proposal a distinction between those to make sure that we have some degree of end user representation.
That's awesome. I honestly, I haven't read the draft recently, so that's my fault for not knowing that. So yeah, I'm glad you listened to me in the past future. So
yeah, well, certainly that's something that was absolutely part of our previous discussions about that. So thanks a lot for representing that. let's see. I think if no one else has comments about the TOC and steering relationship conversation, that's all I've got. Anybody else have things they want to say about that?
I don't have anything to say about that, but I know in the past, sorry, Evan, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was going to go and say one of the things that has come up a few times is sort of kind of what are the roles and scopes of steering committee and so forth. So I just want to make sure that folks are aware of the backlog. So I don't know if that there might be some visibility into some of the things that I know there's a lot of focus has been going on many of these, the composition in particular of the steering committee, but I know folks have asked what are the kinds of things that they do. So maybe getting some updates on those, not necessarily now, but at some point in this public forum, TLDRs of like, hey, by the way, here's the kind of things we've tackled and solved and yada, yada.
Absolutely. Speaking, in terms of my own subjective opinion, I think that's a great idea. And in general, in my experience, if we observe a regular cadence of going over those things and grooming them in public, it helps to make sure that they're actually accurate too. Just my opinion. Anybody else?
I wanted to highlight one thing that came up in the discussion that wasn't specifically TOC steering and related to the text of the 214 proposal. For TOC, we're looking for people who have particular technical expertise in the project itself to evaluate, hey, is this code going to fit with the rest of the project? For steering, I think we're looking for people who have experience with building communities and with, doing a lot of the important background work, like going around and figuring out who's going to fund the CI system, for example. And for that, it may be harder there may be people who would be really good at that who aren't necessarily making day-to-day code contributions. So we may want a different bar for who can be nominated or eligible to be present compared with the TOC.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up, Evan. And I think that's a good point. And this is also jogging my memory that another thing that we had discussed in connection with that as a possibility would be having like a working group or other body within the project where vendors could explicitly be represented as a point of that body, so that maybe that might give vendors that want to participate but need to feel like they've got a voice, but maybe steering is a pretty high bar, so you don't want to have to put somebody onto steering or get somebody onto steering from your vendor to represent those things. That's another possibility that we talked about. I'm not aware of an example of that having been done before. So maybe that's another thing that we can sort of solicit feedback and input from the community from about how any ideas for representing those types of concerns, whether they're on steering or maybe part of a different part of the community. And that's that's just as valid if you're here right now or you're watching on a recording. We'll send another email out when the recording's posted, and maybe we can use that to solicit input on these two things that we've identified.
Yeah, well, I think I was the one who proposed the idea of like a vendor representation committee or council or whatever you wanted to call it. It has the important property that it makes very clear that somebody who is elected to steering is elected as individual for the project, because there is an accepted forum for vendors to state their interest. And so a person coming into the committee is not a deputy of a vendor, right? They're not deputized by the vendor. They are an independent director, independent steering committee member. I think that's a useful pressure valve.
I must say, I kind of struggle to imagine how that committee would operate. Like, would it have agency? Does it have to wait until someone asks it a question? Like,
I have no earthly idea.
Yeah,
I have no earthly idea. I think that's where we would need to sort of poke around for prior art, if not in the open source community, then more broadly.
Yeah, maybe that's a.
Sorry, but I don't think it's urgent to this PR. I think it's sort of like a thing further down the backlog for future discussion.
Yeah, I was going to suggest maybe that might be a good topic to discuss further in like a subsequent conversation on TOC steering relationship. And Julz, I'm sorry to continually talk over you. Please go ahead.
No, I think we were both. I was going to apologize in the same direction. I guess just to like ask the question out loud, because it just feels like it's worth just asking it out loud. In the current way the PR is laid out, we have a nominated section, elected section, representative section, a community, contributor owns the seat section, and we have an end user section. So it's already the case that it's not a fully representative body, right? There's already part of it. You could have an end user committee, right? Separate from steering and just consult the end users. What's the downside of having some proportion of the seats be vendor seats in the same way that some are end user seats?
So I would prefer, my own personal preference would be, if you're on steering, you're there representing yourself as an individual that's working in the best interest of the community, and that is what steering is for. My own opinion.
But that's not, well, I guess that is the case for the end user people, theoretically. Is they are end users, but they're on steering not in the capacity of being end users.
I would say, Julz, there were two things. One was the mechanics of replacing steering committee members becomes a lot simpler if it's individuals, because the mechanic we laid out just automatically bumps them up. Second goes back to a discussion yesterday about like the Sussex Justices principle. Having that separation or that individual focus makes it easier for the community outside the community, so to speak, to accept the legitimacy of Knative. One of the things that, speaking out loud, that has been hard for Knative in the last year or so is a lot of folks have been like, well, it seems like there's a lot of trouble there and I don't really trust the motives of various folks involved, or various companies involved more fairly. We all know that companies are not hive minds, obviously, but you can look that way to an outsider. So having an individual seats and having the limit on particular vendor representation as a cap, I think helps to dispel some of that.
Let me just push on that a little. I feel like there's actually two hesitations people have about Knative. One is, as you kind of state, is kind of like, is there a genuine openness, etc., and a trust in the people behind it, that it's community project, etc. But I think the other is related, but not quite the same, which is there a stability of investment in it, right? Like, are the companies behind it going to continue to be behind it? And I think we want to not solve one of those problems to the detriment of the other, if you see what I mean. And just to push one extra thing in that, I completely get the idea that we want to make sure that this new body isn't dominated by one thing and isn't vendor dominated. But nothing about having some proportion of the seats be vendor seats requires that they be the majority of the seats.
Okay, I see that argument. I would say, however, that there is a time factor. I think that will make more sense, say, in a year after we do the current round of reforms. We could say, okay, we've settled that we can play this way, and then maybe there's a vendor committee off the side and they have to vote and they get one vote collectively. right? And that sort of like creates an explicit channel, that sort of stuff. Like it starts to sort of look like I was about to start naming countries, but that's offensive. A constitution that gets a bit wiggly. Part of the difficulty here is we can't sustain the overhead of a full, like, multi-cameral sort of legislative structure, which is the usual answer to these kind of tensions. Yeah, I would say yes. I believe that some kind of vendor representation that's explicit is good. I believe that it might be useful to have a narrow channel that can be used to vote, but can easily be overruled by the other constituencies. But I would say that right now is probably going to send the wrong signal as an immediate term thing.
So I think someone's got their hand up in Zoom.
Yeah, I just like to, because Julz just say what I was like to say, because I feel like the PR is talking especially to have only like participants and users should be taking responsibility for steering the Knative, and vendors has huge investment on their side for like developing for letting their employees to actually work on that project. So I feel like if first of all, I really like the proposal. I would say that I think it should be like that, but in the real world that we all living in, money and investment matters, and I feel like if we don't respect that investment, sooner or later something might break, and that's why I also think that like we should think of solution to actually respect companies' investment in open source.
So I am hearing those concerns, and I think let me see if I can put a fine point on what I think Chris and Julz, my own version of what I'm hearing, and you can tell me if it's accurate or not, which is that there's a concern that that vendors that are making investments should be represented somehow in the leadership scheme, right? And go ahead.
No, please, sorry.
And I think that's the high level thing, and I'm not sure if it has to be in steering or not. But I'll just ask both of you, is it really material whether it's in steering or not? Or is the material part that there is some representation?
So firstly, just to be clear, I'm not actually so I'm making this kind of point because I think we need to have considered it, right? It's a glaring thing that Istio has gone this way, and nowhere in the original PR have we actually as a community thought through whether this makes sense, right? We've kind of gone immediately to one solution. So I kind of want to make sure that we discuss and come to the viewpoint that we as a community have decided not to go with the kind of stakeholder representation and to go for an individual representation. I'm not actually pushing particularly on one thing so much as that I feel like I want to make sure we've weighed it and are kind of aware of the trade-offs and want to go that way. So it's not so much that I'm like, we must have vendors, otherwise I can't possibly LGTM this. It's more that I just want to kind of feel confident that we're, open-eyed in the decision.
I'm hearing you feel it's a question deserves to be asked in public and examined by the community, but it's not your own personal viewpoint necessarily.
Right. To the extent that I have a personal viewpoint or hesitation, my one worry is if we do, given that there is no vendor representation, I worry that the vendor representation kind of ends up on the people elected as community members. And that feels like an unfortunate tension. And possibly you can do that with this side committee to represent the vendors, such that then it's not on the people actually in the steering. But I haven't seen how that would work, and it feels odd to me, if I'm honest. It feels like if we want to give vendors a say in the direction of the project, we should just give them a say in the direction of the project and not make them proxy through employees who would rather, just do a job.
The thing is that we have that now, and it's caused a lot of sturm and drang.
I think Jaice has had their hand up for a while, so just want to make sure we hear what Jaice has to say.
Thanks. So I think that a really valuable thing here is just let's stop generalizing about this and actually talk about the problem, which is, as a vendor, you may have a priority that's different than the community, and it's not obvious because that's a blocker for you to make a sale. Like that's the bottom line. If I have layer 7 routing, then suddenly I unlock this new thing that layer 4 didn't give me. Like this is a common problem. And so what I think there's plenty of ways to add safeguards in the current governance framework around that, which is you go to the TOC, you say, look, I know this isn't on the roadmap. I'm willing to fund it. I'm willing to have people work on it. I just need to know that there's not going to be headwinds against doing this work, or that it's not off the charts, or it doesn't go against the strategic direction of the project. And the TOC says, you know what, great, but we just don't have the bandwidth to do that. And if you feel like as a vendor that's going against your interest, you can escalate to the steering committee and say, steering committee, I really need, I'm willing to fund it. I've got, it isn't this, blah, blah, blah. And then the steering committee says yes or no. And that's a reasonable escalation path for a diversion of a technical roadmap. Like, vendors aren't going to come in and say, we need to do something with the community that isn't, that's not a vendor thing. Vendors are focused on providing features that unlock sales for their companies and give visibility to the company as a whole. So like, I just feel like the vendor seat thing gets a little bit squidgy, and Josh also mentioned this in the chat too. Like, y'all are vendors, right? Like, let's not. In Istio's case, there's an interesting thing where they have vendors who resell Istio as like the fundamental part of their product. Like it is essentially Istio in a box, or Istio blah blah blah. Knative is a constituent part of other products. It's not necessarily going to be sold as Knative in a box. So like the number of vendors who are live and die by these decisions is relatively low, and the influence of vendors who have these as integrated parts of their products is high. So I feel like the vendor seat may be something that there's an inflection point later as more Knative in a box things happen. But I would caution against trying to differentiate who is a vendor and who's not, because then it sort of creates this really artificial boundary about what actually constitutes a vendor. And from experience, you don't want to get into that. It's a really messy, nasty space.
I think there are at least 2 Knative in a boxes already.
Oh, interesting. Where do I buy one?
Mesh is one of them.
Oh,
it's a really good box as well. Blue ribbon. For what it's worth, I think I kind of buy that as a solution, because I feel like the idea of saying, okay, we're going to start with this and then we'll revisit whether there's more representation over time. It's a pretty reasonable way of making progress, and I think we all agree that all approaches are better than the current situation, and so we should, get to a better situation. At which point, the better situation can always,
Yeah, and I would think the current set of challenges are not necessarily whether vendors are represented on the steering committee or not. I think it's the empowerment of the people who are on the steering committee, and the ratio in terms of how the seats are distributed amongst vendors. Like, there shouldn't be the possibility for a single vendor to have more than half the seats. And the steering committee should be empowered to make the decisions we just discussed. I think if we solve those 2 problems, all the other topics are almost secondary.
Yeah, I want to just
Yeah.
interject here, because poor Doug's had his virtual hand up for quite a while. His virtual arm must be getting tired. Doug, do you want to speak?
Yeah, thanks. So I was going to just put a voice to what I said in the chat. I actually think that if we're concerned about the issue that Julz is raising, and I honestly don't know how I feel about it yet, but let's assume he actually has a point for once. I actually
unlikely.
think, yeah, I know.
Keep it above the belt, Doug.
Well, we're both blue, so we can do that. I actually think the TOC would be more important than the SC, because I think what's interesting is what Jaice said, and I think in what he said was, well, if the TOC doesn't do what the vendor wants and then go to the SC and escalate, it's like, well, I'm not sure that's really what they want, because I'm not sure the SC should or can have the power to force the TOC to make a technical decision, and I don't think we want that kind of tension in the group. So if we're worried about vendors not getting accurate representation, getting what they want out of the project, and without the vendors, we don't have anything, let's be honest, right? Then I think it's the code level stuff that matters more to them, right? Not the higher level business level thing or bureaucracy kind of things that the SC is going to deal with, right? But from a coding side, it's the TOC that's good, that they're going to want the influence over. And so if we're going to designate seats for vendors, I'd rather be at the TOC level, if we're going to do it at all.
Max, I think you've got your hand up too.
Yeah, so sorry about this. I was trying to clarify maybe 2 points. Is that I like the idea of trying to get individuals, but in the end of the day, like many people say, it's you're from a company. And also, even if you're from a company, the reason that you get voted in and you know, reach the level of trust that people sort of see that you're a good person to be part of either the TOC or the community or the SC is because you're acting more as an individual than a company. Of course, you have agendas, everybody does, even if you're an individual, but you're trusted. So I think this notion is the key. And I think to solve the problem of making sure that people are not just dropped in from a company, and they could be individuals, but they just dropped in, they don't have any idea of the community, is that they have already been through the TOC. So in other words, you get promoted from the TOC up. Now, of course, there's a current reality, and that's okay, we grandfather it in, right? So it's the way we start. So if we do something like this, then it forces the notion that if you're in the SC and you're trying to help the community with grand vision, you are either in the TOC right now or you were part of the TOC. So that creates the mechanism of making sure that you have some knowledge and that you understand the code and that you're, you know, invested. I don't know how people feel about that. I probably repeated maybe some part of what your proposal was, Paul, because I quite like a lot of it. So that's all.
Yeah, I think so. Here's like the problem that I'm, just to kind of like regroup and take a step back, is I think that we're discussing how can we make sure that vendors have a way for their wants and desires to be represented. And I think there seems to be a gravity toward like in our discussion, which is just amongst, you know, the people that are speaking right now at this moment, that there's maybe a gravity toward, let's fix this with a formula of seats on some committee. Let me throw something out there that is like, that's in my head as we're talking about this, is if we frame the problem that way, here's something that I don't think it addresses, which is maybe I'm a vendor and I am not currently involved, but I'm feeling like if I could get X or Y thing, I could not only consume it and redistribute it, but I could make a considerable spend of, you know, people hours on developing the project in the upstream. So if we frame the problem as like vendors have to have a seat on a committee, it seems like we're kind of only solving part of it. If there's a established path and part of the community that's for vendors to represent those things, my gut feeling is that that might relieve some of this tension, in the sense that people in steering and TOC can be free to have their community hats on without any ambiguity, and that when there's a vendor level question of or desire for a feature or X or Y thing, that anybody, any vendor, big or small, whether they've previously been involved or not, has a way to express that in public and have it given consideration by TOC or steering or whatever part of the community. It may not even be TOC. It might be eventing features that, like, as an example, and there's a reason that I brought that specific example up that I'll get to in just a moment. Say they need eventing features, right? Like if there's a way for them to do that without like having to figure out how to get to the levers to do it, maybe that's a better pathway. And the reason that I bring up eventing in particular is that I've just come from a eventing working group retrospective, where one of the things that we spent a significant amount of time talking about from different dimensions and different angles is how to represent input from PM type folks, where this time when I say PM, I'm thinking product management or offering management type of personalities, and also how to represent kind of downstream roadmaps for things that follow Knative very closely or are based on it or whatever. So I think there's a hole to that that's maybe larger than just algorithms for how we come up with these seats. And my own gut feeling is that maybe if we kind of take a look at that hole and like as a separate part, maybe to the side of this discussion about the kind of basic open governance stuff, talk about how do we give vendors, any vendor, large or small, adequate representation. Maybe that's a way to kind of eliminate some of that tension that we're talking about. And I've been talking now for a while, so I'm going to stop, at least for a moment.
Evan has his hand up.
Okay. Yeah, Doug had made a point earlier, but I don't even remember what it was anymore, but I'm going to sort of redirect Paul's stuff a little bit. I think one of the roles that I would like to see steering do is more effectively express where we want to put our resources as a project. And, hey, it's really important for us to have docs, or it's really important for us to like hit a certain quality bar, or it's really important for us to have a predictable set of features that, people who are trying to build a business off of this open source project can know when their stuff is going to land. Like that feels like something that's not technical in nature, but is important for the success of the product. And that's a place where I don't know whether vendor hats or community hats are most important, but that feels like, a core piece of what steering should be doing, including potentially saying, hey, how do we, manage to hire somebody to do some contract work on the website if we're not happy with the website design, for example?
Something that's been raised in the past that's sort of in that context is things like vendor neutral training material, right? So yeah, there's a whole list.
Well, but most importantly, I think it should be on steering to figure out which ones of those are important.
So is it fair to say, Evan, that you're trying to limit what the steering committee purview is, so that there is a specific set of things that they are responsible for, that everybody can agree that, we need marketing folks, we need folks that can actually build contracts and so on?
I'm more trying to say that I think that we have a gap right now, and to highlight that there's a gap between what I would like to see the project able to do and what the project is doing right now.
Okay.
Which is not to beat up on the current people on steering, just to say, you know, if people are having trouble imagining what steering would do, I can imagine a bunch of things that I would put on their backlog once we've figured out who the people are.
But anybody in steering is probably very senior in the organization, so they can always delegate to get somebody else to do it for them, right? Like Michael is on our steering, and if he needed stuff done, he's very senior. He could ask us, anybody here, an IBM to do it, and we'll help him. Right.
It's my only job, actually. I only delegate.
I would just ask how high.
Wait a minute.
We
have to listen to Michael. I object.
Exactly. But the point is that that's a little bit of the reality, right? So the question, I think, though, is how in the future, how do we expand it so that people in steering and people in TOC are actually aligned and trusted, right? For me, that's the main thing. But maybe that's not the issue for most. I don't know.
Well, that's actually one of the issues, I think, at the heart of the proposal that we have, is to ensure that that the steering committee has legitimacy because it's determined essentially by community process. And that the people that are candidates to go through that process and run for election are people that are in good standing in the community, that they've demonstrated a commitment to the project values, right? And that they're selected by the community. And I feel like that is, that legitimacy is like the issue that I sense like in that last kind of beat of the conversation. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I think you summarize it. So it's trust and alignment. So how do we achieve that in a way that keeps it sustainable and, you know, people don't get burned out because they're in everywhere and so on, right? It's not an easy question. I mean, there's a reason, you know, Mark Zuckerberg runs Facebook, but he also created it, right? Initially. So I don't know. I think people will go into the steering committee even if they are not necessarily, you know, that was like it's a role that they want. So I really think that you have to go from bottom up, right? Like we're not going to be in TOC until we get elected. Well, we're not going to be elected until we're like contributing a lot, and we're not going to be contributing a lot unless we write a lot of code, right? So like Julz in 3 months is pushing up, right? So that's examples of somebody that is trying to move up, and I'm sure there are others as well. But the point is that's how you build the trust. And once you're in the TOC, then you'll build more trust based on your decisions, and then keep going up. So anyway, I'll shut up and see what others want to say. But I feel strongly that it has to be going up, even if we agree that initially we'll grandfather everything. So that the current members, that's fine where they are, right? But anyways, that's my opinion.
So given this like 10 minutes of the meeting, I just wanted, I feel like we were kind of at the point of moving forward, and then we kind of pulled ourselves back. So I just want to see if we can actually move forward, because I think there was a kind of compromise in the air, which was that I think we all feel that the proposal is better than the current situation, and that we would trust that proposal to result in a steering committee that could tackle the broader problem of how we get vendor points of view and so on. That feels like the compromise that says, okay, is this better? Is this something we're all okay with? And can we solve the stakeholder question, you know, offline? Offline's the wrong word, but whatever. You know what I mean?
I think like we could have a separate discussion around the vendor representation stuff. And I tell you what, like I'm hearing it deserves an AI, like an explicit act that it's something to, you know, eventually figure out in time. I'll take an AI to spin out another side discussion for that. And Vile, act your hand. Go ahead. I think you're next.
All right. Yeah. So no, one of the things I really liked was Jaice bringing this into very concrete particular problems and so forth, because I am not a very good justice expert. I just ride on the back seat of the car. But sometimes it gets very meta and I lose track of what we are trying to solve. So if one of the things we could think about between now and next time we meet, or what, is to go and take some of the examples like Jaice was going there, like, okay, look, here's a particular problem that a vendor might be facing. If we could go ahead and think about what are some of the problems we might have seen in the past, whether it's in this community or another community, and kind of eval that against the current proposal and see how might we solve that and what the steps would look like, I would find that extremely useful personally.
Yeah, I think that's a great, that's a fantastic idea, Vile, to bring some focus to the nebulous aspect that discussion can sometimes take on. Maybe that's a good way to kick off vendor representation conversation. Okay. Let's see. We're at about 8 minutes left. I want to make sure that I communicate that I pushed some updates to the PR yesterday to try to respond to the numerous suggestions and feedback that folks from the community had. And I really appreciate those. So there is new content there if you haven't looked at it since about 6 p.m. Eastern time yesterday. Yeah, so just making sure that's out there for people to know.
And I think as a follow-up, we should probably aim to have another public steering meeting next Wednesday, same time.
Yeah, absolutely.
We want to have a focused discussion again on Tuesday and figure out a topic for that. If that we were just talking about something we should talk about there, or
yeah, Matt, do you think that would be useful time to like kind of start on the vendor representation question? I feel like we have a decent signal out of the conversation that we had yesterday. Maybe we could use that time to tackle this one next. Cool.
So how do we ensure that these conversations don't go on forever?
Well, I think we were pretty clear in our last meeting last week that that this was something that needs resolution, at least on the key principles in the near future. I think we talked about a month being the goal time frame.
Okay.
So
I wasn't sure if it was a month or shorter, but okay.
yeah, so I think the agreement last time, if I recall correctly, is recorded, so this doesn't have to be durable storage, was that the next sort of scheduled public steering meeting, which is a month from, I think a month from last week this time, there would be some sort of I forget.
Okay. Can we get that written down someplace so people can see it after watch the video? Just so people are fairly warned that get their comments in sooner rather than later, because that date is there, looming.
Yeah, and I realized actually shortly before this meeting that we hadn't floated any of this into the PR in a comment. So Doug, and I'll add it to the notes now, that I'll take an action item immediately after this to surface that part of the conversation last time into the GitHub PR, so that it's clear if you're watching the PR.
Okay, thank you.
And for folks wondering when the normal scheduled public steering meeting is, it's the third Wednesday of every month.
Okay, I've got that reflected in the meeting notes now, and I will execute that AI very shortly. Sounds like we might be talked through for now. Any of my steering colleagues want to say anything, or?
Thanks all for joining. I think the discussion has been really helpful for us to kind of, you know, take into account as we sort through this process. So super valuable. I know it's taking up a lot of time, but definitely appreciated.
Yeah, and let's keep the dialogue going via the PR. So we are not back here in a week from now and no progress. I think we should try to close some items in the meantime.
Yeah, I was hoping that we'd have some engagement on from everybody on steering on the proposal by this week, and so far we haven't. So hopefully we'll see some of that coming in the next week.
Yep.
Awesome. I guess that's it. We're just awkwardly staring at each other now. Thanks all for coming.
All right. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Cheers.
See ya.